So, a new Fire Emblem is coming out in 2018. At least it's still scheduled to be released this year, but we've seen and heard nothing beyond the expectedly outlandish rumors. As such, we're going to be doing something that I haven't done in a long time. I've avoided doing these what I'd like to see hypothetical videos in recent years because, well, these types of videos are inherently self-indulgent and, in some particularly toxic cases, come with a sense of entitlement or a level of smoke superiority that the person in question could somehow make a better Fire Emblem game than the people who have been doing so for practically their entire professional career. Admittedly, I do want to make a tactical RPG of my own, but that's not happening until I get a better understanding of how the Unity engine works and, hire people to write music and create sprite work, since if my old thumbnails are any indication, my strengths do not lie in the field of visual arts. In any case, let me state this for the record. Regardless of whether all, one, or none of these happen in the next Fire Emblem game, I'm looking forward to whatever Intelligent Systems has in store and hope that the next game is even better than the last one. I'm approaching this not as a critic, or reviewer, or whatever you want to call me, but as a fan of the series. A fan who's hoping for the best, and taking this opportunity to partake in a fun little exercise, providing some details as to why I'd like to see such and such appear in the series' next non-Echoes entry. There isn't any order or number to this, it's just that the title says. These are my hopes for Fire Emblem's debut on the Nintendo Switch. Let's get started.
You explain that you are the Avatar, and that you are innocent.
Whether thou speak truth or falsehood, I cannot say.
It's almost assured that we're going to see another Avatar character, though the importance of their role within the story is unclear as of now. In Awakening, Robin may have been an homage to Reiko no Ken from a meta perspective, but from a narrative perspective, their increasing importance to the villain's main plot led to Chrom becoming a secondary character in his own story, to the point where the final decision in the game was left in Robin's hands instead of theirs. It wasn't as dankily distracting as shoving them into a narrative which they were clearly not a part of in the original, or Fates' borderline fanfiction approach, but it was ultimately to the detriment of the story. The more passive role of the Avatar in Reiko no Ken worked as a means of reinforcing that you weren't the main character. Your role is important, commanding units on the battlefield, and ensuring the best possible strategy is carried out with the best units, but you weren't the driving force of the narrative. You were simply tagging along for the adventure. Frankly, I'm not confident that they'll reduce said character's importance that much, but there needs to be a more balanced approach than what we've gotten so far. Maybe have the game's Jagan/Oifi character, or a similarly high-ranking official, be the player avatar to whatever campaign the main character partakes in, without heavily interfering with the events of the story, while still allowing them to interact with the rest of the cast via support conversations. This has been a problem with the series since Gaiden. The addition of a world map to a tactical scenario is ripe with opportunities, none of which have been taken advantage of in Fire Emblem because there's very little to find off the beaten path. Sacred Stones had two optional dungeons whose reward was letting you play as dead characters, but ultimately added little to the experience beyond adding a few maps, none of which particularly great, and a method of grinding that didn't involve the arena. Awakening and Fates tried to address this with the similarly structured paralogs, but unless you're interested in recruiting the children in each game, they have little to offer with their paltry single, non-parent involving paralog. Besides that, there's a slew of possibilities for these side quests to explore beyond a second generation of units. They can flesh out the lore and expose us to the inhabitants of this world, add excursions to recluse areas in order to gain access to legendary weapons, or even unlock special classes via unique reclassing seals. The latter worked wonders in Tactics Ogre, introducing the player to both classes and characters that they've never seen before, but we'll talk more about Let Us Cling Together in a moment. Speaking of opening up the world...
How are you, gentlemen? All your days are belong to us.
While Path of Radiance may not have been as redefining as other Nintendo series jumps to 3D like Super Mario 64 or Metroid Prime, it did bring several series firsts, the very best of them being base conversations. For the uninitiated, they were exactly what the name implies, brief interactions before a map that occurred within the player's base. Save conversations were just as fleshed out as the supports in Path of Radiance, and somehow managed to be even more well-written than the ones in Radiant Dawn, with varied outcomes to boot, ranging from dialogue that further refined an already detailed drawing of the denizens of Tellius, to giving Ike and company a new face to befriend or an item to use, to providing subtle hint about the incoming encounter, and potential strategies to use. Why it hasn't made a return is beyond me, because it was the most brilliant addition the series made up until, the pair-up system in Awakening. If nothing else, it would make for a great pairing with the My Castle feature from Fates, should the latter make an encore appearance. controversial as it may be to say, I'm not opposed to the idea of having the marriage and child mechanics sticking around for at least one more entry. However, it needs a major overhaul. Its presence in Awakening was a cue nod to arguably the best entry in the series, not an argument I'd be making, but I digress. But the implementation left a lot to be desired outside of an admittedly clever story-based explanation for how the children and parents could fight alongside one another, something that becomes evident when the story-based foundation in Fire Emblem Fates amounted to the daycare equivalent of the hyperbolic time chamber. It worked far better in Seisen no Keifu because the children were like a cast of a second game that picked up where their parents' journey left off alongside a handful of characters that were playable over the course of both generations. As such, it made for a more interesting storytelling engine and base from which to build an entire game. As an example, and to build out the previous hope, you could have this hypothetical generation explore new lands that were previously inaccessible or partake in quests that show how much the world and its people have changed in such a short time frame. This one is fairly straightforward. We're not living in the medieval age like the characters are, representation in media is important, and frankly they really screwed up their last attempt with Soleil and Fates, so best to rectify that mistake as soon as possible.
Bye, Felicia.
This was originally going to be about moving on from Kozaki and Kozaki Hara, the duo responsible for the character artwork in Awakening and Fates. However, I've already said my piece on Yuzuki Kozaki in my reviews for Awakening and Fates, and I prefer not to repeat myself for a third time, technically fifth, but I digress. What I haven't talked about nearly as much is the person responsible for my main criticisms of the aforementioned artwork, Toshiyuki Kozaki Hara, art director for Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Fates. Put simply, his approach to character design, most specifically the armor that the characters don, has not left the most positive of impressions. The Kozaki Hara era of Fire Emblem has featured some of the absolute worst armor designs in series history, with more than a slice of obscene objectification for the women. What with how it favors giving them boob armor while the male characters get proper chest plates, have little or no armor in areas where they should for the sake of fan service, and, in the case of Echoes which he was directing, gives an Escher Girls a spine-twisting pose to a prisoner of war for the sake of including TNA in a series whose fan service has become increasingly grating and less tasteful with each successive entry post-Awakening. Oh, and to heap more praise on the Path of Radiance, since it's probably going to be some time before I review it, Titania's armor isn't just among the series' best, it's one of the best sets of armor for a fictional character in any video game. It looks like something you could see an actual human being wear into battle. Point being, more of this, less of this, or this, or this, or this, or they. I could go on, but by now you get the point. Now, Fire Emblem typically gets a new character artist and art director after every 2 entries. In fact, they already got a new character designer for Shadows of Valentia, but while I would say that Kozaki Hara has far outstayed his welcome, given that he was the director for Shadows of Valentia, which in hindsight explains a lot of the changes pertaining to Celica's actions, this is among the least likely of my hopes to occur. On the subject of unlikely shakeups, in case the sprite that you're seeing on screen hasn't made it clear, I love 2D sprite work, 2D animation featuring sprite work, and especially the 2D animation for the classic entries of Fire Emblem, the Game Boy Advance trilogy in particular. It's almost certain that they'll opt for polygons over pixels, but even though Fates and Shadows of Valentia were an improvement over the largely unimpressive animations of Awakening, there's simply no competition as to whether Fire Emblem looks better with or without the extra dimension. Not to mention which one is more fertile soil to break with better hardware. Take a look at the typical criticals one finds in the GBA entries. Whenever a character is about to score a critical hit, they typically break into an elaborate animation before landing a blow. This allows for the player to be surprised by the change in animation without killing any of the battle's momentum, clearly conveying the strength behind this unanticipated attack and provide a build-up to the eventual payoff, that being the screen shaking and the explosive decrease in an enemy's health as a result of the attack. Just imagine the fluent and, more importantly, over-the-top sprite work that could be created with a Switch's more powerful processor or, barring that, hand-drawn animation a la Arc System's 2D fighters. Oh, and while we're talking animation, no more cutaways when a character gets a critical hit. All this does is stop a character's actions dead in its tracks, rather than let their movement do all the build-up for how powerful their attack will be. I wanted to do an entire video on Permadeath in the post-Awakening era, but since it's relevant to explaining this concept, let's talk about it. Following the introduction of casual mode in Awakening, there's been a vocal contingent of older fans who feel that its inclusion has ruined Fire Emblem to make way for the casuals. Something that, as an older fan of the series, I don't get. Not even for the further maligned Phoenix mode, mostly because I realized that these modes aren't designed for me, nor do they affect how I play Fire Emblem. Put another way, it doesn't bother me how other people play the game because I'm not a 5-year-old in the schoolyard yelling at someone for not playing the game the way they do. I don't care for heroes at all because, well, it's a gacha game, but I'm not going to get angry at people for spending money on the game, much less for enjoying playing it. In fact, if the main reason for people choosing casual mode was due to the lack of interest in the strategy portion of the game, I'd be fine with a mode that lets them skip the battles and just enjoy the dialogue because, again, the story isn't the reason why I play or enjoy Fire Emblem. To me, Fire Emblem's main draw has always been how it marries its storytelling and gameplay, and the way I play Fire Emblem is to reset the game if a character dies, learn from the mistakes made prior to their departure, and see how we can better approach a given map. That having been said, one thing that cannot be denied is that casual mode has highlighted how, mechanically speaking, there isn't any substance to the current incarnation of Permadeath, mostly because it hasn't kept up with the changes that the series has made since its inception. Back in the first Fire Emblem, whenever you lost too many units, you'd receive a generic one to replenish your ranks and give you a better chance of beating the next chapter. Granted, there were reasons why you'd want to make a better attempt if you simply scraped by, since said generic units were usually inferior, but since anyone not named Marth, Nina, Camus, or Garnet didn't have much personality to speak of, and were virtually ignored from the overarching narrative outside of the scene in which they were recruited, it made sense that they could be so easily replaced. There wasn't a whole lot to these characters, so the player didn't have any emotional attachment to them when they died. There wasn't a whole lot to these characters, so the player didn't have any emotional attachment to them when they died. That was also true of its sequel. Gaiden barely had a story to begin with, to say nothing of characters with any personality. It wasn't until the series hit the Super Famicom where we started to see more complex side characters and the relationships to one another, i.e. the downfall of Hardane and Moshino no Nasa, and the conversations from Seisen no Keifu that, in conjunction with a lover system, would lay the foundation for support conversations in Fuen no Tsurugi. Nowadays, even minor characters have novel-length writing pertaining to their backstory, personality, relationships, and overall development via support conversations, boss encounters, and various other events. As such, it's always weird that most characters don't have much, if any, reaction when one of them dies in battle, be it a close friend, sibling, or so on, let alone acknowledge their passing outside of the epilogue. The only time the defeat is ever acknowledged by other characters is for the sole purpose of explaining why a given character who's no longer playable can appear in a future cutscene, i.e. hand-waving the disconnect between the mechanics and story that would otherwise be present without these few lines. The addition of Milla's Turnwheel and Shadows of Lentia, which should also be in the next entry, may have been a logical evolution of reset and retry by way of cutting out the need to reset the game, but it failed to address the problem that Permadeath no longer has a practical purpose. I guess they tried to address this with Shadow Dragon's Gaiden chapters, but show of hands, who actually like how they handled the Gaiden chapters in Shadow Dragon? Yeah, didn't think so. Nobody likes giving up half of their roster in order to get a character who's, let's be frank, not as good as the ones that you let die. Actually, second show of hands. Who actually remember that they did that in Shadow Dragon before I mentioned this? No, you did. Anyway, the way I see it, there's only two ways to address this problem. One, remove it entirely, which will surely increase the animosity that older fans already throw at newer ones. Or two, expand the concept with something like post-mortem conversations. Think of them as support conversations that are triggered by the death of someone close to a given character, such as a woman dealing with the loss of their younger brother who fell in battle. This scenario has a plethora of possibilities. They could build off the character's previous established relationship and have them remember some special moment the two shared. Pair up characters who normally wouldn't interact with one another or don't even share support conversations as they cope with their loss and what said past character means to them. They could even take a page from Fates and have them obtain remembrance seals that allow them to take on the class of a fallen friend or the person they're talking to. Also, while it would absolutely need to be an option so as not to turn off more casual fans, if you really wanted to cater to the satyrs who grew up on 3CS776, or were looking for an opportunity to further bring together the storytelling and gameplay, you could have said characters suffer from decreased stats in the next few battles as a result of their grievances, or have some of them be unavailable while they come to terms with the fact that their friend, family member, lover, or whatever else a character may have been to them is never coming back. These are not the only options, of course. They're just some of the first that come to mind because, again, there is so much potential for these types of conversations. While Fates like to play it fast and loose with the killing off of its characters, the fact of the matter is that death is not something that a person simply processes in a day or two or even a week. Permadeath has seen a lot of fascinating experiments in recent years, so there's no excuse for a story series like Fire Emblem to keep it in such an out-of-date state.
Let us cling together as the years go by. Oh, my love, my love.
You may have noticed that I haven't included any observations about the story or how to, quote-unquote, make it good. That's because such observations presume that the writers of the last few entries actually sought to make them bad. Fates may have been an astonishing mess, but it wasn't what Intelligent Systems and Kobayashi intended. They were trying to tell a more deep narrative than Awakening in order to address the criticism lobbed at that game. To its credit, there were plenty of interesting ideas in Fate that could have made for a compelling narrative in any one of its trio of titles. It's the execution where it faltered. Having said that, if Intelligent Systems is intent on taking the series in the more complex direction that Fates was supposed to, and they're looking to outsource the script one more time, there's no better choice for who to pen it than Yasumi Matsuno. Not just a veteran tactical RPG designer, Matsuno is a fantastic writer who can go toe-to-toe with the very best in the industry. The writings in his game boast complex characters, shocking twists and turns, and a more grounded approach to alignments and branching past than many of its contemporaries, all of which are exemplified in his magnum opus, Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together, one of the best tactical RPGs ever made, which itself received one of gaming's greatest remakes. He was also responsible for a little title you might have heard of called Final Fantasy Tactics, though I prefer Tactics Ogre between the two, but that's besides the point. Between his revered tactical duo and the similarly compelling Vagrant story, his resume has more than enough qualifiers to take up the task of transcribing a truly terrific tale for the next chapter in Fire Emblem's history. So those are my hopes for the next Fire Emblem. Let me know what you thought of them and what you'd like to see. Until next time, game on, my friends.